Welcome to this month's edition of Last Month in Criminal Justice. Today we're going to be looking at developments during the course of March, and we're going to be covering 6 areas. Shortly we're going to come on to the question of, is the youth justice system re-traumatising girls and young women? Then we're also going to be looking at the question of whether the police need fundamental reform. We're going to be asking why it is that so many adults appear to be held on remand in prison awaiting trial. We of course are going to be talking about the distressing case of the strip searching of child Q, and we're going to end with a discussion of inspectorate of police. We have an inspector who's just retired and a new one who's chief inspector rather, who's retired, and a new one who's just started. So we're going to be having a bit of a conversation about that. And we're going to start also with the inspectorate. We're going to be talking about Prison Inspectorate and proposals it has to stop making recommendations when it makes inspection visits. I'm joined by an excellent panel today to discuss these issues. First of all, by Rob Allen, who's one of the most respected researchers and consultants on criminal justice and prisons. Hello, Rob, and thanks for joining us today. Joined also by Jess Southgate, who's the Deputy Chief Executive of Agenda. Hello, Jess. Thank you so much for joining.
Hi, Richard.
And finally joined by Rick Muir, who is the Director of the Police Foundation. Hello, Rick, and thank you also for joining us.
Hi, Richard. Delighted to be here.
If you want to take part in the conversation, we have the Q&A function that you can use. You can put a question or indeed just a comment, anything that that kind of strikes you as we're having the conversation. And what we're going to do is we'll take those questions and comments in order. So I said we're going to be starting with a discussion about the Prisons Inspectorate. So if you have anything burning that you want to share with the panel or the audience, you want to have answered in relation to prisons inspection, then now's the time to do it, or in the next 5 or 10 minutes, because we'll then move on to the next item, and it's unlikely that we'll be able to come back to that particular item. So get those questions in early. There's no such thing as a silly question, of course. So if there's something that strikes you and you want to pose it to the panel, then please do that, and you can find the Q&A function either at the bottom of or the top of your Zoom app, depending on whether you're on Apple or Microsoft or something like that. I don't quite understand these things, but as I understand it, there should be a little button for you to look at. All right, let's move on then to the first item on the Prisons Inspectorate, and in particular its suggestion in early March by the Chief Inspector of Prisons, Charlie Taylor, that the Prisons Inspectorate was planning to stop making recommendations for improvement when they inspected prisons. The Inspectorate typically makes around 30 recommendations following an inspection. It is a process, according to Taylor, that, quote, can create a blizzard of paperwork for both the prison and the prison service and can distract governors from getting on with the actual job. Instead, Taylor proposes that the Inspectorate should pick no more than 6 priority concerns for prison leaders to focus on. Now, one of our panelists today, Rob Allen, described Taylor's proposals earlier in March as a puzzling move, which he said risked letting the prison service off the hook at a time when it was already failing to make progress against many of the Inspectorate's recommendations. Rob, I mean, the Inspectorate argues that, you know, it's much better for prison governors and prison leaders to have 3 or 4 areas to really focus on of a broad nature rather than static recommendations when maybe, you know, by the time the report's out, things have moved on in the prison. Why do you have concerns about what the Prisons Inspectorate is proposing?
Well, I suppose when I saw it, I was a bit surprised because I thought making recommendations was a kind of core activity for the inspectorate and for inspectorates generally. The Prisons Inspectorate is the lead body for what's called the National Preventive Mechanism in the UK, which is the UN mandated body to prevent torture and ill treatment of people in detention. If you look at their website, it quite clearly says that the role of detention monitoring is to make concrete recommendations to improve the treatment of of detainees. So to sort of shy away from making recommendations to simply raising concerns seemed to me slightly odd. I mean, I can see what Charlie Taylor's saying, that there's a lot of recommendations that prisons in effect can't possibly implement all of them. But I mean, that's a bit of a shocking state of affairs. The inspectorate has got a set of expectations on how prisons should run based on international human rights standards. And really its job is to say whether that's happening or not, and what needs to be done to ensure that it is happening as far as possible. Sure, make some priorities, and in fact already they raise key concerns and have key recommendations, but I'm not sure that going down the road that they're proposing is necessarily the best way of doing it. I mean, perhaps there could be a distinction, maybe on these core human rights issues, there should be some definite recommendations. Maybe on some of the other range of issues that the inspectorate looks at, purposeful activity, arrangements for resettlement, I don't know. Perhaps there could be concerns, I don't know. Perhaps it's a technical question really, but it just seems a bit surprising to find that, we're an inspectorate, we make recommendations, nothing much is being done, so we're not going to make them anymore. Doesn't seem a great lesson to me.
I mean, there is, because it's not uncommon with prison inspectorates, sadly, in this country, you'll have inspection reports referring to rats or, human feces in showers, or, I remember one report where there was a prisoner who was kept in a cell with a broken toilet and bare electricity wires, which were live, being exposed. And, I would myself, I suppose, have concerns if the concerns of the inspectorate referred to the quality of the cells, and maybe the prisons needed to look at tidying things up, rather than sometimes focusing on something very granular and very specific, saying get this prisoner out of this cell, or what on earth is all that rubbish doing piled up in the corner as a place for rats. And over the years we've had some kind of very good chief inspectors, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that Charlie Taylor isn't one of those, but some very good chief inspectors who've kind of almost carried in their inspections a certain moral authority and moral clarity about just focusing on some very particular issues and just saying, we can't have this in our prisons. And isn't there a risk that if this gets kind of, ends up being so many concerns, or indeed a few concerns, they become so general as to lose their kind of force and power?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a risk of that. I mean, hitherto, when they go back to a place, in fact, only recently they've started doing these reviews of progress, which is precisely designed to see whether a certain number of recommendations have been acted on or not. And they produced a report recently on a prison where they found some have and some haven't. I think that's a really good idea, the idea that these recommendations drive change, and the inspectorate checks whether they've been done periodically. I think you're right, and I'm sure, and occasionally you read about examples where during inspection visits they have come across something so egregious that they've gone to the governor and said, look, you've got to do something about this now, and that is done. So I think that should continue if they are coming across some clear kind of violations of basic human rights when they visit. Instant action is needed. Equally, and I remember previous inspector David Ramsbottom was keen on this, there's a question about whether the inspectorate should have a say not just about individual prisons, but about the prison service more broadly in terms of their policies and practices. I mean, Ramsbottom years ago recommended that children shouldn't be kept in prisons, and the government didn't accept that. They kind of set up the Youth Justice Board, the incoming Labour government, and tried to improve things. And, yet 20 years down the line, we've still got kids in prison service custody, and it's not a fit place for them. Contrast that with Scotland, where 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Chief Inspector of Prisons said prisons are no place for children under 18s, and last week, I think, the Scottish government announced that under 18s would be removed from prisons, and care-based alternatives. We have to wait to see whether that happens. But that seems to me, a good use of an inspectorate saying, look, we can try and make these places slightly better in some ways, but actually there's a point at which you have to say this kind of institution or this element of the system is not only not working, it can't be made to work, and we need to have something broader.
Yeah, there's a couple of comments here on the Q&A, which I think are kind of relevant here as well. Mark says, head of one of the inspection teams of male prisons at HMIB, the Inspectorate, is a former governing governor of Wormwood Scrubs. Isn't this and the latest proposal to let governors get on with things, indicating too close a relationship between inspectors and governors? And Lewis making a kind of a similar comment. We believe the Inspectorate have concerns about who is ultimately in control of the prison estate. And I guess this is one of the issues here, that if the Inspectorate is offering general concerns and leaving it to governors to kind of decide how best to respond to those concerns, it might lead to some excellent outcomes, but it might lead to maybe some less than optimal outcomes. And I guess this might be particularly the case in an area, the women's estate and in the youth estate, which are often sort of overlooked, really, I think, in a system which is often geared around the needs of male prisoners, if indeed it's even geared around their needs. Jess, did you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I can understand the rationale around trying to reduce the amount of recommendations and highlighting priority areas of concern. I think what we'd want to see in the women's estate, whatever the mechanism, is an ability to be able to highlight where there are those areas of key concern and where there's similarities across the system, but not lose the ability to make really targeted recommendations, particularly where we know there's good practice or there's learning that can be carried across from one prison to another. There was recently a very good but concerning report, which you'll have seen from HMIP, summarising some of the key concerns across the last 6 months of 5 women's prisons. And that was able to really pick out massive areas of concern around vulnerability, poor responses to self-harm and mental health. And by being able to shine a light on that across the system, it is able to kind of highlight the fact that all women's prisons need to be doing better. But I would be concerned that if you stripped out recommendations entirely, it then loses the opportunity for inspectors to point to, as you say, Richard, the real specifics about where prisons are failing, but also to give indications of where they could improve.
And anonymous attendee has sort of asked a question about the role of the independent monitoring boards, and we might want to pick that up just towards the end of this conversation, because I know it's different, for example, in England and Wales compared with Scotland. There's a kind of a slightly different set of arrangements across those different jurisdictions that Rob, you might want to pick up on in a minute. But Rick, did you have any kind of thoughts on this topic before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I think in danger of just agreeing with everybody. I think that there's clearly a concern. I mean, nobody wants to sort of drown the system in sort of thousands of very precise recommendations that just make people's lives very difficult. And and from the point of view of those working in prisons or running prisons, they it just kind of makes it a very bureaucratic kind of exercise and reduces their kind of ability to tailor what they're doing to the local situation. Nevertheless, I do agree that there should be a space for quite targeted and specific recommendations, particularly in prisons. I think the same would be true in policing, in areas where human rights are concerned, situations in custody, use of police power, those kind of areas. I think there should be space for that. So there's a need, I guess there's a need for some discipline on behalf of the inspectorate about not creating too much that just kind of makes it hard for people to see the wood for the trees and to focus on the key areas, but retaining an ability to be specific in some areas, while also drawing out some more systemic lessons which you want the various authorities to respond to. So it's a complex task, but I think in the course of the conversation, it's become a bit clearer to me where the kind of scope of the things that you probably need in place. And it seems like Charlie Taylor may be going a bit far in getting rid of recommendations entirely.
Yeah, well, time will tell, I guess, with this one. Rob, did you want to just very quickly pick up this point about the independent monitoring boards?
Well, I mean, only to say that obviously the Inspectorate of Prisons is one of, well, three bodies really that make recommendations to prisons: the independent monitoring boards, the old lay visitors, but also there's the ombudsman that will make reports when sadly people lose their lives in custody, and also you've got inquests when people lose their lives in prison, and there can be prevention of future death reports that have clear recommendations or action that has to be taken by prisons or by the Ministry of Justice. So it is an elaborate kind of picture in terms of the range of things. Each of those elements has been sometimes criticized. Some people say that the monitoring boards become too close to the prisons that they visit and are pretty toothless. I mean, there's one out today on Ford Open Prison, their annual report, which reports on the fact that some wooden wartime billets had finally been emptied because of the fire risk. The monitoring board had been asking for this for 13 years. They were finally condemned by I presume, the Crown Premises Fire Inspectorate that goes around to look at these things. And so there was a huge shortage of capacity. Some containers were introduced. Then 2 people were put into these pods. That was dangerous. And they describe it as a waste of public money, because then they had to be reconfigured. I mean, they provide a very interesting and not always reassuring picture of how things are on the front line of prisons. But I mean, the bit that stuck with me is 13 years. There was another report a few weeks ago saying they've been asking for something to be done for 20 years or something. So whether they are taken seriously, they make recommendations to ministers, to the prison service, to the individual governor. But sadly, too often those things are kind of explained away or not dealt with. There's a bigger issue here, which we haven't got time to go into now, but I think does deserve some consideration in due time, is whether one or all of these bodies should have stronger powers like regulators do. So as far as healthcare in prisons concerned, if the Care Quality Commission, who accompany the inspectors, find something that breaches the expectations they have, they can insist and legally require change. Is that a road that inspection and monitoring of detention should go down? There are strong views on either side of that. So perhaps that's something, well, you might want to pick up in one of these in the future, or in some other forum, have a proper discussion about the pros and cons of whether that might bring about improvement.
Yeah, I think it's sort of inspector as regulator versus inspector is an interesting question, and we might want to return to it. But I suppose, like reflecting on this conversation, I kind of, reminded that, the prison system is often characterized by enormous inertia. I mean, 13 years to get rid of some sheds, which I imagine date back to the Second World War, so they've been around for a long time even then. And whether the inspectorate, by changing the way that it identifies its recommendations, turns them into concerns, will actually help to address that inertia, or just help to, as it were, to kind of represent it in a new form. I guess only time will tell. The proposal is now in the pilot stage, so it looks like we are going to see prison inspection reports going forward which contain concerns, not recommendations. So we'll certainly keep an eye on the progress of that as it unfolds. So thank you for that. Time is always against us really on this program. We'd like to kind of keep it sort of moving along and busy. So it's timely to move on to the next item, but we'll certainly come back to the question of prison inspection, I'm sure. So the next item relates to the youth justice system. Up to 90% of girls in contact with the youth justice system have experienced abuse from a family member or someone they trusted. 63% of girls and young women serving community sentences have experienced rape or domestic abuse. Yet girls and young women in contact with the youth justice system are often, sorry, where am I? I've lost my way. I lost my place in the script. There you go. It's not all entirely spontaneous. Let's do that bit again. Yet girls and young women in contact with the youth justice system are far more likely to be treated as offenders requiring punishment than trauma and abuse survivors in need of support. A new report published in March by the Young Women's Justice Project, it's a collaboration between Agenda and the Alliance for Youth Justice, calls for the justice system to prioritise the needs of criminalised young women. Also in March, the Centre for Women's Justice published a report criticising the unjust criminalisation of female violence victims. One of today's panellists, Jess Southgate, contributed to the Young Women's Justice Project report, and I'm delighted that she's able to talk more about it now. Jess, the justice system, I mean, I've kind of been working in this system for, around criminal justice for over 20 years. Rob, even longer than that. And Rick and you, I know, both been around a long time as well. And, it's never been very good at responding to the needs of criminalised girls and women. It's not that this is a new problem that you've identified. I mean, what's going on? Why is it so difficult to kind of get a sensible arrangements in place?
Yeah, well, we all know, of course, that the criminal justice system is designed primarily by and for men, and it has ever been the case. And that because women and girls are seen to be a minority in the system, it has been designed around male offending. And whilst there's been some welcome progress around adult women, although, still a very, very long way to go there, young women and girls in particular are completely missing and overlooked. And it was that we wanted to shine a light on through this project. And it's not just in the justice system, it's also the kind of broader youth services and statutory services that young women who become criminalised and caught up in the system are in touch with, often long before and also at the same time as their criminalisation. And I think because, in the public imagination, youth crime tends to be seen as, by boys towards boys and the general public, and that the risks that they pose or are perceived to pose to the public are seen as far greater. So girls have just kind of completely sort of fallen through the gaps. And girls themselves are very aware of that. They feel that they're in a system that isn't designed with their needs in mind. Of course, what that then what that means in practice is that directly affects what's funded, what's considered in policy terms, what's measured, who gets listened to, and that just really limits the development of effective practice. And as the Centre for Women's Justice report also showed, there's still massive failings in the system in terms of responding to the experience of women who are both criminalised and victims themselves. The system just doesn't seem to be able to cope with that experience, and the same is true for young women as well. So, as you say, often when they're in need of kind of care and support and coming to the attention of the justice services, they become criminalised and sort of treated with punishment instead.
So the report that you published earlier this month, it's called "We've Not Given Up," I think is the title, and we'll certainly circulate the link in the follow-up email from this program. It's an excellent report, and it's really well worth reading, and actually very accessible and easy to understand, I think, for anybody not familiar with this issue. But how would you characterize what you and the Alliance for Youth Justice are proposing? Is it more kind of evolution? Are there things to build on, or are you looking more at a kind of effectively a fairly radical systems change and overhaul?
Yeah, it certainly needs to be a sort of systems change approach, but there are some really welcome developments that we can build on. So we're really pleased that during the time of the project, there's been the development of a girls' care strategy in the youth justice system, and in HMPPS, the development of a young adult women's strategy and practical guidance for staff in prisons. And this is now a really good opportunity to build on that. There's also within MOJ a kind of a reworking of the way in which MOJ MOJ is looking at women and leading on the female offender strategy. So now seems like the perfect time to really be embedding an age appropriate as well as a gender responsive and culturally responsive approach to women and girls. So we really want to see that taking a really kind of comprehensive approach to the needs of young women. And that has to be cross-departmental, because as with the experiences for women who are criminalised, as I say, their needs are cross-cutting, housing, education, mental health, and so on. And all of those departments need to kind of play a role to ensure that, particularly for girls, the approach is one of early intervention and prevention and you know, direction away from the youth justice system, as well as then when they're within the system, making sure that they're getting a gender and trauma-informed response, that it's a holistic response, and that they can get better services and support in their communities. There are great pockets of really good practice that we've seen, but unfortunately this tends to be very much in the minority, and there's real issues around transition. So from the youth to the adult system, but also in the community for girls to be able to get support at this very disruptive time when they're transitioning between services, but they also might have lots and lots of different professionals involved in their lives. And then a change in expectation, which they feel very profoundly when they reach 18, where they kind of shift from what might have been perceived as perhaps quite interventionist, but slightly more welfare-based response into a much more punitive one. And crucially, and I think the recent National Audit Office report into the female offender strategy and progress around that, which sort of showed that that has not gone far enough, we need a series of outcome measures that can enable that to happen. And the strategy needs to be resourced. You know, the female offender strategy has been woefully under-resourced, and this young adult women's strategy, it was announced in the Prisons White Paper, which we're really pleased about, and HMPPS are really kind of grasping the opportunity. But unless it's got the kind of strategic buy-in from MOJ and the proper level of resourcing, there's a limit to what professionals can do, and there's also a limit to the relationship they can have with those crucial women and girls services in the voluntary sector as well.
And the report also out in March from the Centre for Women's Justice, made the case that there are many women, particularly abuse survivors, who are being unjustly, unfairly criminalised because of what's happened in their lives, as it were, and that's what's led them on to do. And the kind of the old cliche that most women in prison are in prison because of the men in their lives kind of springs to mind. So, is there an argument for saying, look, the justice system is about punishment? That's what it's there for. You've broken the law, you're punished. And what we actually need is not to try and mix that up with some kind of welfarist approach. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing that and preventing, women and girls getting into the justice system. But, is there an argument that kind of trying to get a system geared towards punishment to somehow be, in colloquial terms, kinder, is always going to be doomed to failure? Or am I being too cynical here?
No, well, you're quite right. I mean, the sort of the disadvantage and the inequalities that draw women and girls into the system are really profound. And the young women that we spoke to for the report describe this sort of spiral of disadvantage, which started with, one very poor experience early on in life, which was then compounded by another. And then that sort of continues and escalates. And the more that girls experience punitive responses and inappropriate responses that also don't meet their cultural needs from professionals, the greater the level of distrust that they experience, the more disempowered they feel, the more disappointed they are that the services that they think should be there to protect them outside of the system are failing them. So the idea that they're then sort of drawn into the criminal justice system because of these vulnerabilities, and girls as compared to boys in the justice system, they're more likely to have been in care, they're more likely to have been permanently excluded, they've faced very, very high rates of poor mental health. If we're not getting that right at that early stage, then drawing them into this punitive system is just a further kind of undermining any sense that we're going to be able to address those issues, but it's also undermining their own faith in the system. And then that leads to this really damaging narrative that girls themselves are the problem, that they're the ones who are hard to reach, that they're the ones who are failing to engage, rather than locating the problem with the professionals, with the systems and services that have failed them in the first place. So I think we do have to take a kind of holistic approach and try and make it one of welfare and support rather than punishment throughout the services that they're in contact with.
And picking up on that, your point about, you know, services that have failed, and there's a question here from both Mark and John, both the same question about this case of three girls or so being held in a male young offender institution, Wetherby. And, you know, as John says, you know, what does it say about the system that this is seemingly the only option for these girls? I mean, what's kind of Agenda's view on you know what happened there, where you know anyway. Yeah,
I mean, it's absolutely shocking, and girls that we've spoken to who've been in male-dominated STCs in particular describe just feeling so much in the minority and really shocking and awful experiences of harassment and sexual abuse, and just this feeling that you know that they're sort of walking through corridors where they're being watched all the time, and that they're sort of they're so aware of the kind of lack of support that professionals can give them in that context. I think, you know, that something very profound has gone wrong to have led up to them being there in the first place. And it also, as I say, it's a reflection of the failure, and we see this with adult women as well, that there isn't the level of support in the community that those girls could be held in other kind of welfare-based placements outside of prison. It just, yeah, it's a sort of shocking level of disinvestment and lack of investment in specialist women and girls services that leads up to that kind of outcome.
Thank you. We need to move on to our next item in a minute, but Rob, I mean, some thoughts from you. I mean, you actually, you know, served on the Youth Justice Board for a number of years, and indeed, you know, a lot of your background, certainly an earlier part of your career, was very much in the youth justice field. I mean, are we any better now at kind of addressing the kinds of issues raised by, you know, by Agenda in the report that they published, and the issues that Jess has just spoken so eloquently about? It kind of feels very familiar somehow, you know, we seem to be going round and round in circles.
Well, I mean, we're better in one respect, which is that we have got very, very many fewer children and young people in the deep end of the system in custody, and that is good. That's boys and girls, but particularly girls. There are, you know, a handful really of girls under 18 in custody, and that's good news that number has fallen. But I agree with Jess that the fact that, I mean, what happened was that the secure training centres, which could take both boys and girls, have basically failed as a model. One closed down, one is on restricted numbers, I think. So there was suddenly a need to find alternative accommodation. Quite why secure children's homes weren't able to take the handful of girls, 3 or 4 girls that ended up at Wetherby Young Offender Institution, I don't know.
Didn't the inspector reports say that the children's homes refused to take them?
Yeah, and that is one of the issues. I mean, you know, secure children's homes offer by far the best quality of care of the 3 existing types of secure establishment for young people. We're waiting for the first secure school, one of Charlie Taylor's ideas from 6-7 years ago when he did his youth justice review, yet to open. Will it open in September this year? Is it going to be further delayed? Will it take girls? There is a lot we don't know about that, both in terms of timing and issues. But one of the things about the secure children's homes is that they can, I think, decline to take certain individuals. Is that right? What should the contractual terms be between the youth custody service, which is now the bit of the prison service that deals with the placement of children, and the individual secure children's homes, which are by and large run by local authorities? It's a complicated setup, I think. But I would personally like to see secure children's homes, and maybe if the secure school works, being the only types of custody we have. I think secure training centres have proved not to be good, and the young offender institutions are just fundamentally inappropriate. So keep the numbers down, drive them down yet further if we can, and then develop care-based institutional arrangements if those are needed, community-based ones preferably. That seems to be what they're planning to do in Scotland, is to find alternatives in the community or semi-secure. We need a bit of innovation of that nature this side of the border as well, I think. And it's possible. The law is there for children that are sentenced to detention in a young offender institution. The government can specify particular places where that sentence can be served. It doesn't have to be in one of those three types of establishments. So
interesting.
As far as I know, it's never been used, but that power is there and needs to be.
There's scope for some sensible reform there. Let's move on to our next item on policing. Now, policing requires root and branch reform if it is to tackle the crisis of public confidence. So states a major independent review of the police carried out by the Police Foundation. The review, the product of more than 2 years' work, argues that the public are losing confidence in the police, and it calls for major reforms, and we'll get onto those in a minute. The report comes in the same month that the outgoing Chief Inspector of Police, Tom Windsor, warned that in its rush to recruit new police officers, the Home Office was at risk of recruiting misogynists and racists. Also in the last few weeks, the National Audit Office warned that the Home Office evidence base for additional police officers was weak and based on optimistic assumptions. So as always, lots to discuss around the future of police and indeed the present of police. And I'm delighted that who's one of the authors of the Police Foundation report is here to talk this through with us. So Rick, let's just start. I mean, when we were just kind of warming up for this event, you mentioned that the last time there was a Royal Commission on Police was in 1962, you said. Your report is a sort of an attempt at a Royal Commission. Do you think we need a Royal Commission on Police, or is it really a matter of following through on the recommendations in your report?
Well, I think we tried to do what a Royal Commission would do with this report. So my hope is that we've done everything that a Royal Commission would seek to do. I think that the challenge with the Royal Commission is just realistically, the government doesn't seem interested in having a Royal Commission on the police, which is why we set up our review, because we felt that somebody needed to take a long-term view. I mean, the reason we called it a strategic review was most policing policy is generally about responding to short-term, quite tactical political considerations, rather than thinking about, well, how is the world changing? What kind of police service do we need in the context of that change? Where are we going to be in 20 years' time? What do we have to do now to get ourselves in a position to deal with the challenges of the future? There's been precious little of that kind of strategic thinking around policing, so that's what we tried to do with this, and I hope that it does the kind of things that a Royal Commission would do.
The report is called A New Mode of Protection, Redesigning Policing and Public Safety for the 21st Century. So it kind of sounds very very ambitious, really. What's your how would you characterize what the main recommendations that the review came up with?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are sort of two things, Richard. So one is, we say there's a crisis of confidence, and I think there is a crisis of confidence at the moment in policing, not just of the public, but I think actually within the police service. Lots of police officers themselves lack confidence in the way in which the service is set up, and so there are some issues clearly around police conduct, which have obviously been in the news rightly over the last few years. And I think those have directly led to a drop in public trust and confidence in the police. And we make a series of recommendations around the misconduct process, around training and development of police officers, around leadership, which I think is probably the biggest thing, which is proper, high quality frontline leadership is the key to tackling these issues around racism and misogyny and toxic cultures and so on. And then the second thing we say is that the world has changed dramatically, and yet the police service hasn't really caught up with social change. And so it's still organised really along the lines that it was when the 1962 Royal Commission was set up. It's organised in its 43 forces, 95% of the resourcing is locked in those local police forces. And yet, 53% of crime is now fraud and cybercrime. So there's just a real mismatch between the kind of public safety challenges that we've got and the kind of police service that we still have. And so we call for significant changes to the way in which the service is organised, the kind of skills that police officers have, the kind of people who are being recruited into policing. In all of those areas, I think we need change.
Mm-hmm. And we had you mentioned, some of the kind of the fairly disastrous kind of recent cases, the Charing Cross police station case being a case in point, the policing of the Sarah Everard vigil. Just this morning, there's a report in one of the papers of a police officer who's been, I think now is resigned from his post, but was found to have basically breach of, rules of conduct for basically sexual assault on at least 2 women. Meanwhile, the CPS has ruled that there isn't enough evidence to prosecute this police officer. So it kind of feels that, the police are, we talked about this actually in the last edition of last month of Criminal Justice, the question about whether police service as a whole are just in some form of systemic crisis, actually, which is, it's partly about structural, and it's probably about a number of those issues that you've mentioned, Rick, but it's also just maybe a feeling that the public feel they just, they seem to be a law to themselves and aren't really being properly governed and ruled. There's a comment here from Jenna in the Q&A saying, through experience, I find that the police are policing themselves, not professionally, but to cover their mistakes. Independent investigations would fix the system. So Rick, just a kind of a sort of a final thought from you now on that, the degree to which, do we just need much more rigorous governance of the police, much more rigorous accountability, much more kind of assertive, work to tackle abuses of the police when they come up?
Yeah, clearly we need strong governance and accountability, and arguably in many ways those things have been strengthened in recent years. The fact that we have an independent complaints body, which we didn't have before, there have been, the fact that we have police and crime commissioners, whatever people think about them, I think have enhanced local accountability of police of the police. The previous police authorities weren't particularly visible or well known by the public. So I think there has been some movement on accountability. I think we have to hold people to account. I would look at the misconduct process. I do think it needs reform. There are far too many officers, it seems to me, who have been found to have found guilty of misconduct and yet remain in post, guilty on multiple occasions and yet remain in post. I think that needs looking at. I think we need to look at the way in which the misconduct hearings are chaired. I think there's some issues there, some specific issues there. But I come back to this thing about skills and leadership and training. And I think that's where there's a real crisis at the moment. You can talk to police constables who will tell you that they very rarely meet a sergeant or an inspector. And I think some of this is in relation to austerity, the fact that there are fewer frontline supervisors. But you've now got all of these much more inexperienced, it may be a very good thing that we've got these much younger police officers coming through the system now, but of course they are much less experienced, and they are going to require proper training. They are going to require really strong supervision. And, within the police service, it's the sergeants and the inspectors who hold the chief constable holds the formal power, but the social power within the organisation is with the frontline supervisors, and they get very little in terms of professional development and support with their leadership. And I think there needs to be investment there. And I think because they're the people who are going to set the tone, they're the people who are going to say that's not appropriate behaviour, these are the expectations we have. And that's where I think there needs to be a big investment now in that frontline supervisory level, because I think that's the thing that would help tackle these issues around toxic cultures developing.
Thank you, Rick. Jess, I know you wanted to sort of come in just on the question of violence against women and girls, and we're going to return to a kind of another issue around policing a bit later in the program. We talk about strip searching of child Q, but there's this kind of sense that male violence towards women is simply not taken seriously by the justice system as a whole, but also by the police. I think it's been a real running issue actually for many years now, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the confidence of women and girls in the police has decreased massively as well, because all of these examples are just shining a light on the fact that women are being poorly served by the police, both as victims and as alleged perpetrators of crime. And it's not just clearly, a few bad apples, and it's really welcome that there have been some steps taken nationally to prioritise the policing of violence against women and girls. The appointment of Maggie Blythe as the Deputy Chief Constable, who's now coordinating the national response to violence against women and girls, is really positive. The inclusion of the strategic policing requirement around VORG as well is also really welcome. But whatever the outcome of the various inquiries into these particular incidents are, I think the police need to recognise that there are kind of wide cultural systemic issues here, and unless there's a kind of an accountability, as Rick said, and a process of kind of truth and reckoning around that, around the sexism, the misogyny, the racism that is endemic in the police, rather than suggesting that it's just a few kind of individual officers that need to be rooted out. Nothing's going to change, I think, in terms of women's confidence at this stage, and that would be a great shame.
Thank you. Okay, well, look, the report that the Police Foundation have published, we'll circulate the link to that. It's a significant report. It's, I think, almost 200 pages long, so it's not a light read, but I'm sure it will actually be a kind of a key reference point for some years to come in the debates about the present and future of policing. So thank you, the Police Foundation, for producing it, and I'm sure we'll probably return to a number of the themes in future editions of this programme. What we're going to now do is move on to the question of remand prisoners. Between March and September 2020, which is the first 6 months of the COVID lockdown, for anybody who can't quite remember, it seems to be going on forever, the number of prisoners held on remand grew by 22%, reaching its highest annual figure in 6 years. Remand prisoners are held in prison while awaiting trial, so they are formally innocent. Currently, around 1 in every 7 prisoners, nearly 13,000 people, are held on remand. Many are stuck in prison for more than a year awaiting trial. Even if found guilty, many do not actually end up with a prison sentence. In March, the House of Commons Justice Committee announced an inquiry into the remand system. And for those who are interested in making submissions, you can do so until the 22nd of April. I thought it would be interesting to just kind of explore, what's going on here. So Rob, I mean, the whole kind of remand system, I mean, the slowdown in the court system clearly must have had an impact. There were people who were being held in prison who would have otherwise gone to trial, who didn't go to trial because the courts were effectively closed for a significant period of lockdown. But the remand population had been increasing, I think, prior to lockdown. So it's not something that can simply be laid at the hands of the COVID lockdown. So what's going on? Why are so many people being held on remand at the moment?
Well, it's a good question, and it's a question that is perhaps surprisingly not that easy to answer. It's one of the kind of under-researched bits of the system, remand processes. I mean, there's been some work recently. Transform Justice have done some very good work on the remand issue, often based on kind of going and sitting in courts and observing decisions. There's been some research done. Ed Cape and his colleagues have done stuff in the past, but there's not a huge amount of statistical evidence to draw on to get a full picture of what happens at the remand stage. What we do tend to know is that magistrates' courts that make the vast majority of remand decisions don't spend terribly long in reaching those decisions. Having said that, okay, we've got about 16% of the prison population comprised of, is made up of people on remand. It's actually much higher in some other countries, 30% in France, in poorer countries with struggling court criminal justice systems, it can be, you know, anything up to 70 or 80%, because simply people are left in remand detention until some day comes when they might appear in court. We're not anything like that here, but you're right. The fact that delays to court proceedings mean people will spend longer is deeply to be regretted. And I think any, you know, introducing firm time limits on particular cases, you'll remember that even for children, the time limits were removed for a period of time during the lockdown to reflect the fact that court sittings were being hampered. I mean, there's two issues, I suppose. One is the length of the time that people who are remanded to custody spend awaiting trial. The other is, you know, the amount of people that get remanded to custody, whether there are alternatives to remand that are fully being exploited. And I think the answer to the latter question is no. Are there always probation officers in court, for example, who might be able to ask for a brief adjournment and put together some sort of package of support or supervision which would enable a court to say, okay, we're not going to remand you to custody, but we're satisfied that if you are bailed with the following conditions, that will be fine. I mean, remember, there is a presumption of bail. The conditions that have to, the criteria for remanding somebody to custody are about whether that person is a flight risk, whether they will interfere with witnesses or the course of justice in some way, or whether they might offend again in the future. We don't really know which of those criteria are the ones that are most commonly used. I suspect it's the future offending one. If it's a flight risk, we've had a big expansion of electronic tagging. That should be able to deal with that. But I suspect that practice on the ground in magistrates' courts means that, you know, the kind of alternatives for certain alleged offenders aren't fully being exploited. I did a little bit of work on this last year for the Barrow Cadbury Trust, looking at young adults. And it was, I think, 10% odd of people who are remanded to custody had been charged with theft offences, 13% drugs offences. They might include some very serious alleged crimes, I don't know, but it seems to me there is some scope for trying to ensure that there are better alternatives available than remanding people to custody.
I want to come back to the sort of alternatives in a second. There's a comment here from Nicola, who I suspect might be a magistrate. I disagree with the point that remand decisions happen too quickly and not much consideration is given. A lot of the issues relate to not being able to satisfy bail conditions. Taking someone's liberty is not something I take lightly. And I guess the point there, you know, that we can draw from that is that in terms of remand decisions, there must be a huge amount of variation in practice. I'm sure there are some, you know, excellent magistrates who think very hard about remand. I dare say there's probably some magistrates who maybe take a slightly more casual view, you know, because that's just inevitable in any profession. There are, you know, there's a variation in practice. But thank you, Nicola, for that comment. That's really helpful. I mean, just thinking about, you know, different, you know, alternative forms of, and you mentioned flight risk. You can understand a situation. Let's say, for example, if there's been a case of alleged domestic violence, and you know, it might be felt that housing someone awaiting trial with their alleged victim may not be appropriate or desirable. So there may be some cases, and as you indicated, Rob, particularly if there are serious offences or there's a real flight risk. But, you know, I mean, in a sense, you know, the remand system has its roots, you know, in, you know, centuries ago, when, you know, somebody might commit an offence in a village and they're locked up in the local clink overnight, you know, to come before the Justice of the Peace the next day. And as you indicated, you know, we have different forms of detention, electronic monitoring being a really obvious one, and tagging, or, you know, just kind of other forms of monitoring. And it's in a digital economy, that's a lot easier. So, yeah, I mean, there must surely be more imaginative ways of ensuring that individuals don't run off, but can nonetheless, you know, await trial from the comfort of their sitting room rather than the discomfort of a prison cell.
Yeah, or other forms of accommodation. I mean, there used to be bail hostels available. There are still some on paper, but I think there is a lack of capacity, and a lot of the kind of supervised accommodation that might be available in this tends to be used for different categories, more for people perhaps who are released from prison early, serious offenders who are deemed to need closer supervision, have kind of taken more of the places. And I agree. I didn't mean to be critical of magistrates. I'm sure there are some who do worry very much about restricting people's liberty. I think that the concern is that they aren't always served with the information and the options. In the youth system, it's better, but the remand numbers are still too high, much too high for youth. But at least there is somebody from a youth offending team who will generally be available in a youth court to intervene. Not always, not if the court is on a Saturday or whatever it might be. But I think both youth offending teams, and particularly the probation service in their sort of new model, need to take court work a lot more seriously, make sure that they're available, that they're confident enough to intervene, to ask for short adjournments where necessary, and try and exhaust all the alternative options, I think. But that does take a little bit of time. And I think the incentive sometimes is perhaps just to reach a decision, and whether that decision is, and it will be, mostly will be bail, but there are perhaps some that do go to custody where that could be avoided. And on the electronic monitoring point, I mean, we have seen an expansion of that. We've got GPS monitoring ostensibly available, but I've yet to really see an impact of that in terms of reducing the numbers in custody, either on remand or in fact to monitor curfew requirements that might form part of a community sentence. I hope there is some sort of evaluation or monitoring of that going on, because I know CCGS has looked into this over the years. It's been it's been a not particularly impressive area of technical and policy development, electronic monitoring. There's quite a lot of money wasted in various schemes that never quite materialized, but it often seems to offer the promise of being able to reduce the use of prison, but whether that's actually turning out to be the case is a lot less certain, I think.
Yeah, when we looked at this a few years ago, I think at the time there were about 20,000 people on a tag in some form and about 80,000 in custody, and we did wonder whether, you know, if you had 80,000 on a tag and 20,000 in custody, that might be a form of progress. But the risk, of course, is you keep the 80,000 and just get another 80,000 on the tag, you know, which is the argument about net widening, of course. We must move on. We're going to come to shortly to the question of the Chief Inspector of Police, the one Tom Windsor who's just retired, and the new one who's just been appointed, Andy Cook. But before we do that, we're going to have a chat about the very disturbing case of child Q. The school probably should not have called us, and we should probably have understood very quickly we had no role to play there. Those are the words of Detective Chief Inspector Marcus Barnett, commenting on the awful case of child Q, a 15-year-old black schoolgirl who was strip searched by police in her school in Hackney after wrongly being accused of possessing cannabis. Now, the Superintendent Marcus Barnett has faced calls to resign, as has the head teacher of the school. The girl referred to as Child Q in the safeguarding review was so traumatised by the incident that she was left wanting to, quote, scream, shout, cry, or just give up every day. The safeguarding review also concluded that racism had likely been a factor in the decision to strip search Child Q. And FOI information that's come out in the last few weeks suggests that the Metropolitan Police conducted around 9,000 strip searches of children over a 5-year period, which works out as about 5 every day. In Hackney, where Child Q was subjected to the strip search, 60% of children strip search last year were Black. Jess, I want to sort of come on to the question of sort of racism in a second, but one of the things that struck me about the coverage of this awful case is that that Child Q was wrongly accused of possessing cannabis. And whilst that may well be true, and it makes the strip search kind of that much more horrendous, I'm wondering whether even if she was possessing cannabis, even if she did have cannabis on her, as many young people do, whether that could really justify a strip search. You know, can there ever be a situation where it should be justifiable that the police should be strip searching children?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer to that is no. It's hard to imagine many circumstances where it would be, given the significant impact that it has. As you said, that safeguarding report found that the repercussions on that young woman were significant, and the trauma that she described, saying that she thinks she was never going to feel the same again, that her aunt said that she's now self-harming and requires therapy, and she herself said that she wants to make sure this never happens to anybody else ever again. Of course, for young people who've experienced domestic or sexual abuse, that's going to be even more traumatic and triggering. And of course, in her case as well, she was menstruating, which further demonstrates how humiliating and degrading that particular practice is. And if you look at the statistics released around strip searches in the borough at the time, there were 25 searches of children under 18, 19 of which were male, so we can perhaps assume 6 were female, 18 were handcuffed during the process, and the majority were in relation to suspicions about drugs. But there was an outcome of no further action in 80% of those cases, so it's really hard to see how it's a justifiable course of action.
And it's not uncommon. I mean, I know from personal experience, my wife is a school teacher, and now and then she will smell cannabis on a child, and whether the child themselves has been smoking it seems unlikely given the age of the children that she works with. But likely the parents or the relatives, they may be in a room where cannabis is being smoked, and regardless of, there's a broader issue therefore in relation to child welfare, about children's exposure, to drugs, which may or may not be harmful. And it just it beggars belief for me that a decision was taken anyway to treat Child Q as a suspect who needed to be searched and potentially prosecuted, than as maybe a young woman who may or may not be in a vulnerable state requiring support and care. And, is this an issue about racism in the police? Is this about an issue about the police in schools? Should the police be in schools to be conducting these kinds of searches in any case?
Yeah, exactly. And this sort of speaks to the broader theme that we've been talking about today around what is the role of the police in responding to some of the most vulnerable and marginalised women and girls and vulnerable young people. And the safeguarding report highlighted that the adultification bias that probably led to the police and the school to treat that young woman as older than she was. And we see that very commonly amongst young women. We heard it repeatedly from practitioners and girls through our own work. And there have been studies that show if you ask adults their perception of the kind of maturity of young girls, both Black and white, they will describe across all measures Black girls as being seen as more adults. And so, of course, that then translates into how all adults, not just the police, but also education and other services are responding to them. So this is really about, as you said, a failure in safeguarding, a failure to protect young people. So even if we look at this around strip searching in particular, my concern is that this will generate a lot of concern around that as one particular practice, without taking the opportunity to look at the system as a whole and thinking, what is it that led to, as you say, is it police in schools? Is it a failure amongst education? That led to this young woman being treated in such a way. And we can't just have this be a kind of a moment of outrage that is then forgotten and moved on from.
The Education Secretary has indicated that they are looking urgently at tightening the guidelines around, I'm not quite sure what the guidelines will be that they come up with. I guess we'll have to wait and see. But Rick, I don't know if you can help us on this. I mean, the police claim that they have quite strict rules around the decision to search, and there is a difference between, you know, a pat-down search and who can conduct that. You know, please remove your jacket kind of search, or, you know, something we might, you know, kind of colloquially call a strip search, and the decision-making, you know, kind of process that's undertaken in order to authorize these searches. And I suppose one thing I'm not myself sure about is, did what the police do in that school, was that within the guidelines? Is that, and it's maybe the guidelines need to change, or was it a breach of the guidelines, or is it, there's just so much we don't know about that, it's difficult to say at this stage?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the legislation, and the power comes under PACE, and having read it, it seems to me that they were in breach of they did step outside of the guidelines that are there. I think that the power to do a search of an intimate search of that kind has to be necessary and proportionate, and it seems to me that neither of those conditions were met clearly in this horrific case. And I think they were, on the surface, it seems to me that they were in breach of the guidelines in relation in this particular case. But I do think the guidelines need to be looked at, because the volumes of strip searches of children which have been brought to light as in the aftermath of the case, I think, you know, it's alarming. It's alarming, particularly those relation to suspicions of drugs, which, you know, possession of drugs is not a serious crime. It's not a crime which should therefore require excessive, you know, use of police power in this way. And so I think that this whole issue, the legislation needs to be reviewed. The role of the way in which the schools interact with the police needs to be reviewed. I'm fine with the police going into schools to talk about their job and sort of do all that kind of stuff. I think that's having safer schools officers and things like that, I think is a good thing. But the police coming into schools to deal with issues that should be dealt with by schools is absolutely wrong. And we don't want to go down the route that they went down in the US, which is a complete, you know, where the police are really, really involved in routine school disciplinary matters in a way which is completely inappropriate. So I think this, I mean, it's a horrific case. I agree with everything that's been said by Jess and by yourself, Richard. And I think that all of these matters now ought to be reviewed, because the volumes of strip searches that are taking place of children are alarming. And I think that, as you say, in looking for drugs, it's hard to imagine why it's necessary or proportionate to undertake a strip search of this kind, given the trauma that is likely to result from it.
And again, I mean, the figure, you know, 60% of children strip searched in Hackney last year were black, and it's difficult to, you know, kind of, you know, well, probably draw our own conclusions about what might be behind that, I suppose, would be fair to say. I mean, before we move on, I mean, over the years, there has been a suggestion from some places that police use of strip search and some of these other kind of quite intrusive powers they're sometimes used as a kind of an alternative punishment or an informal punishment, rather than for what might be considered legitimate policing reasons, you know, maybe to send out a message to particular groups, we're watching you, or make sure that when someone happens to them, they go back to their friends and say, oh my goodness, do you know what happened to me? Don't do that, because this will happen to you too. I mean, do you have any kind of Do you think there's any truth to that? Is it kind of one of these slightly sort of overheated allegations, or is there maybe some truth to the suggestion that sometimes these powers are being abused in ways which are really very difficult to square with any, principles of good policing?
Well, I think it's something that needs. I'm not aware of any research which would illuminate on that. I think my sense of it is probably that in the majority of cases that's not the case, but there may well be in incidents where that is the case, and where people are where the power is being misused, and clearly in those cases that would be a case of misconduct, and that's inappropriate. What we do, there is good research on the use of stop and search, which which has found that there is a sense in which the police are using that power in order to exert power and authority, as opposed to necessarily deal with a specific incident or a specific suspicion, and I think that is worrying. And one of the things we say in our review is that stop and search should be used much less than because of the impact that it has, and because of the racial disproportionality with which it's used. So I think it's very hard to say in an objective way, but I think, all of these things, in all of these areas of use of police power, there needs to be transparency, there needs to be accountability, there needs to be independent observation of what's happening, and I think that's absolutely the case with the use of strip search.
Thank you. We've got a comment here by Amy, I suppose picking up both on this point and some of our earlier conversation in regards to the diminishing trust and confidence in the police amongst women and girls. I wonder, to what extent do you think we can enable an institution such as the police to adopt democratic norms, values and principles? Interesting question. We don't have time for today, but we maybe want to return to. And also just a couple of observations about remand from our previous item. Mark pointing out the large proportion of suicides within prison from remand prisoners. And Lorraine raising concerns about the use of remand for own protection and the lack of data on this. So again, I think a real area that we're very interested in as at the centre here, the use of remand, and something that we may well return to in the future programmes. Let's move on to our final item on the Chief Inspector of Police. At the end of March, Sir Tom Windsor, Chief Inspector of Police over the last decade, stepped down. Windsor, the first non-police officer to take on the role, was a controversial appointment at the time. His replacement, Andy Cook, has a bit of a return to business as usual feel about it. He's the former Chief Constable of Merseyside and has pledged to get police forces more focused on detecting crime and catching criminals. We thought it would be interesting to finish this programme by reflecting on Tom Windsor's period as the Chief Inspector. As I said, it was a kind of a controversial appointment at the time, and it'd be, I think, good to just reflect on that and also think about the challenges for his successor. But let's start with Tom Windsor. Rick, it was a controversial appointment at the time. It was seen as a bit of a kind of, Theresa May, who was then Home Secretary, kind of thumbing her nose at the police establishment, trying to break up a bit of a cosy old boys club. Was it, looking back on it now, was it a good appointment? Did Windsor kind of reshape the role in a way which was, was good and has kind of put the inspectorate on a different kind of footing compared with his predecessors?
Within policing, this is a controversial position, but I think it was a good appointment. Actually, I think that it has been refreshing to have someone from outside the system coming into that role. I mean, he was controversial because he did a review of police pay and conditions, which led to lots of police officers marching in the streets, and so they saw him as the sort of the axe man in terms of pay and expenses and all of those things. Now, whatever anyone thinks about that, I think that he. I think it's been refreshing to have someone from outside policing come in and do that role. And of course, he was also controversial because he's very forthright in what he says. I think that's a good thing. I think having someone who likes to shake things up a bit, mix things up a bit, isn't scared to sort of speak kind of unpalatable truths to people. I think that's a good thing in an inspector, actually. So I think looking back on his time in office, it was good. I think he definitely did improve. Controversial, yes, but I think he did improve the inspectorate process. The system that they introduced for inspecting police forces, the so-called PEEL system, is much better than the system they had before. I think that was an improvement, and he's been pushing quite hard on policing to to improve the way it deals with technology, and he's put in place. He put forward some proposals around that which weren't taken up, but I think on paper they were good proposals. So yeah, I think having an outsider in that role has proved its worth, actually. And so I think his time, and actually if you speak to senior police officers, most of them kind of agree with that now. So while it was controversial at the time, I think most people think, yeah, actually he's done a good job, and he's said some things that maybe needed saying that perhaps wouldn't have otherwise have been said.
And I mean, he sort of, almost kind of as he was preparing, putting all his possessions in his crates to move out the office, he got into something of a dust up with the College of Policing, didn't he? Where they published a report and they criticised the inspectorate. Who said that they set, it was all about who inspects and who sets standards and this kind of stuff. And they actually wrote to Tom Windsor and said that he had fundamentally got wrong, both in law and in policy, his whole approach. So it was a bit of a kind of, he had a number of spiky engagements over the years, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. And as I say, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think having someone who's not part of policing in that role, I think is valuable. And I think that whatever you think about his individual positions on different things, I think just having someone who's an outsider, I think is valuable in the system. And I think he had enough people around him, obviously, who are familiar with the system. I mean, that's always the challenge with inspection, isn't it? You need some people there who really understand it in order you can really get to grips with things. At the same time, you need the independence to make sure you're not captured. So you've got to. There's always has to be a balance there. But I think that I think broadly it was a good thing. Yeah, I mean, I think he's actually right on the law in relation to the role of HMIC, which is that they can inspect on pretty much anything they want. But I think it's also true that the college is right to say that we need to think a bit harder. The system needs to think a bit harder about the relationship between the standards it sets and what HMIC FRS inspect on, because the allegation is that they're just making up their own standards. But they would say they're doing that because the college doesn't have enough standards to inspect on. But that's part of the relationship between HMIC and the college is something that I think needs looking at.
So you've spoken very highly about an outsider and what, breath of fresh air and all the rest. So putting you on the spot, does that mean that Andy Cook is a bad appointment? Should they have gone with another outsider?
No, I don't think that. I mean, I think probably if I'd been in the position, I probably would have gone for another outsider. I think that's probably my bias, but I don't mean that in any way as a casting any aspersion on Andy Cook, who I think is a very strong appointment. And we interviewed Andy Cook as part of our strategic review, and the people who were doing the interviews said that he was, one of the most interesting people that they interviewed. And I don't know him personally, I haven't spoken to him, but I think that he. So I think he is a, clearly having been a chief constable of Merseyside, a very sort of formidable figure. But yes, if I had been the Home Secretary, I think I probably would have gone for another outsider.
Okay. There's Nicola here would be keen to maybe be in touch, Rick, just to kind of ask you some questions related to some research that she's working on. So Nicola, if you want to just email the office with your email details, then we can certainly pass them on to Rick. And if he has time, I'm sure I'm volunteering your time on your behalf, Rick. I'm sure if he has time,
very happy to do that.
I mean, but that's almost the end of our program. But I'm just there's a kind of a general question here, which we started with inspections and we're ending with inspections and inspectorates. Rob or Jess, I don't know if you have any kind of thoughts on inspections in the general sense. Rob, you flagged up the issue about regulatory approaches rather than inspection approaches. Jess, you might have some thoughts just to bring us out to a conclusion. Rob, do you want to start?
Well, I think I'm right in saying that as far as the Chief Inspector of Prisons is concerned, it has to be somebody who has never worked for the prison service. I think, that independence is enshrined in the if not in the law, certainly in practice.
Would you recommend that for policing then?
I think so. Yeah, I think as Rick says, obviously you need knowledgeable people who can inform, provide the technical and other information. I mean, I do some independent investigations for the Ministry of Justice into near deaths in prison, and they're under Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which requires an independent investigation into certain kinds of cases. And the independence there means I couldn't have done it if I'd worked for the prison service, but I have an assistant investigator who's a former prison governor who can let me know, what's going on and all the rest of it. And that seems to me a sensible kind of model. The only other point, which is more specifically about Andy Cook, the new prisons chief inspector, police chief inspector, who again, like Rick, I've not met him, but I did read this piece. He ostensibly said that if he was given £5 billion or something, he would spend it on poverty reduction rather than more police officers. And he was pressed a bit about that when he appeared before the Home Affairs Select Committee and slightly sort of rode back from it. But he does seem to be somebody who recognises that the roots of crime and the solution to crime doesn't solely lie in people choosing to behave badly and you need to arrest them and deter them and punish them. And I suppose whether that translates into anything he can do with his inspection hat on. So, for example, looking at the relationships police have with other agencies in the community. This issue that has always intrigued me, I mean, Rick probably knows the answer, this claim that very high percentage of police work actually is dealing with mental health and other non-crime emergencies of one kind or another, really getting to the bottom of that and looking at it and coming up with some proposals for a better allocation and distribution of responsibilities between agencies seems to me it's something that is worth doing. Looking at, I mean, the whole question of the police role in crime prevention, I think we'd all agree here that prevention is better than cure. Rick's report has got some interesting recommendations about trying to kind of re-inspire the whole vision of crime prevention and how other agencies can contribute to that, local authorities, of course, business and so on. Whether that kind of work, although the police role might not be massive in that, it's of huge importance in terms of crime. Who should be monitoring and inspecting that kind of activity? So I think, potentially there's some interesting directions. And as Rick says, if he as a new chief inspector can pretty much decide what they inspect, I'd suggest inspecting some of that.
Thank you, Rob. And just finally, I mean, this whole issue about sort of independence of the inspectorate, and goes back in a sense really to some of the other issues we've been talking about today, about the confidence that members of the public and women and girls in particular may have in the police. And maybe if it was a genuinely independent inspectorate which didn't have ties to the police in that way, might help to improve confidence that the police are being held to account. I don't know. It's a slightly rambling question to finish, which you're very welcome to pick up and run with, or say what you want to say and completely ignored, I've just said.
No, quite agree. And I think the public need to see, and women and girls need to see, that there are across the justice system independent inspectorates, but inspectorates that are also bold and courageous and are prepared to speak out where they see these kind of issues and a number that we've described cutting across police and probations and prisons today. And I think also all of this is making me think, as well as this, we also need a government who are prepared to then drive that forward from the centre as well. So we can't just see kind of individual examples. When there are these kind of broader systemic issues, we need to make sure that our government and our cabinet are really driving forward the changes recommended.
Thank you very much indeed. That's a great place to end, I think. So look, thank you very much to Rob and to Rick and to Jess for giving us so much to talk about today. And thank you very much to our audience and all those who contributed in the Q&A. Our next our next event will be on the 20th of April, when we'll be having lunch with Charlie Weinberg, the Chief Exec of SafeGround. And then our next last month in criminal justice will be in the first Wednesday of May. I can't quite remember what the date is off the top of my head, but we will then be discussing the criminal justice developments during this month. And I suspect we will, amongst other things, be talking about the departure of Cressida Dick as Commissioner of the Met, and who might be replacing her. So lots to talk about, I'm sure, but thank you very much for coming to today's Last Month in Criminal Justice, and I look forward to seeing many of you on our next programme. Thank you.